In July of 2016, 23-year-old hiker and aspiring photographer Eliza Reed set out on an early morning hike in Zion National Park, Utah. She promised to be back by lunchtime and was never seen again. Eliza's backpack was found cut open under a rock. Her phone and satellite beacon were missing. The search dogs stopped at one point on the trail as if the girl had evaporated. 7 years later, on the night of her birthday, the old landline phone rang in the Reed family home. On the other end, there was only a distorted hiss, metallic interference, and a voice her mother recognized immediately. It was Eliza. She said only one thing. "Mom, they won't let me go. Find my eyes." Zion National Park, Utah. July 2016. The heat was stifling, the sky was mercilessly clear, and the air shivered over the hot rocks. Hikers were climbing the narrow Angel's Landing Trail, which had long gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous in the United States. On this particular morning, 23-year-old Eliza Reed, an aspiring photographer and college student from Ohio who had come to the West in search of new images for her portfolio, set out to do so. She left her hotel at dawn, carrying a light backpack, a tripod, a smartphone more expensive than most of her other belongings, and a satellite beacon. The habit of recording every route was part of her discipline. Eliza was well aware of the risks, as her mother insisted that she always take communication equipment with her. She promised to be back by lunchtime. It was the last promise her family heard from her. In a few hours, when the heat became almost unbearable, no sign of Eliza was received. She did not return in the evening either. When the hotel owners found her room empty and her bed unmade, they first thought she had stayed overnight at the campsite. It was only the next morning that she was officially reported missing. The search and rescue operation unfolded quickly. Dozens of volunteers and rangers combed the canyons, a helicopter circled the cliffs, and dogs picked up the trail at the beginning of the route. The Angel's Landing Trail was difficult. Narrow ledges, metal chains for support, sharp climbs that could be fatal in the heat. The idea of falling from a height came up immediately. It was not unusual for tourists to fall here, but the search did not yield the expected result. 12 hours after the search began, the rangers came across her backpack. It was lying down under one of the slopes. The thing was cut open lengthwise, as if with a knife, and completely empty. There was no camera, no water, no documents inside. The satellite beacon was gone. This became the first big mystery. In most cases, things are scattered by accident when falling, but no one cuts the backpack and removes its contents. The dogs followed the trail for a long time until they reached a certain place on the trail. There, they stopped. The animals behaved as if the road for Eliza had ended in mid-air. There was no scent, no direction to go further. For experienced dog handlers, it looked strange, but the official protocols kept the wording dry. The trail was lost due to difficult terrain conditions. From the first days, the police stuck to a simple version: an accident. The girl could have stumbled, fallen into an abyss, and her body was dragged into a gorge where it was not visible from the air. Helicopters flew over the canyon several times, but found no signs of her. Rescuers explained that rock cracks and deep fissures can hide a body for years, and sometimes forever. Eliza's family received the first news from Zion through official channels. Her mother, Sarah, flew to Utah the very next day. She walked with the rangers along the trail where her daughter was last seen. At the official briefing, the words were, "Little chance. Probability of a fall. The body may never be found." In the early days, the search seemed still realistic. But a week passed, and all efforts were gradually curtailed. All that remained was the protocol. In July 2016, Eliza Reed disappeared in the mountains of Utah, presumably killed in an accident. Her body was never found. The official version took hold, but an empty, cut open backpack, a missing phone, and dogs that lost the trail at a point where there were no branches left disturbing gaps in the case. It seemed that the girl had not just fallen off a cliff. She seemed to have disappeared. Several years have passed. Since Eliza Reed's disappearance in the Utah mountains, the official case has gradually lost all activity. In the archives of Zion National Park Police, there is only a thin volume with short-ranger reports, search route maps, and a few photos of the backpack found. The last note in the file is probable death by fall. For the family in Ohio, this wording meant nothing. The body was never found, and there was no evidence of death. The mother, Sarah, did not allow herself to say the word funeral. In the living room of their home still hung a large photo of her daughter with her college diploma, smiling, camera in hand. The father, Tom, tried to go back to work, but often stayed home, sitting by the window, looking out at the street, as if he was waiting for his daughter to walk in. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, the family's life turned into an endless wait. Every year, Sarah wrote letters to the police, demanding that the search be resumed, but received only standard answers. Without new evidence, resumption is impossible. She was offered the support of psychologists, but she refused. Instead, she kept her own archive. In the basement of her house, there was a closet full of boxes, newspaper clippings, copies of protocols, printouts of emails, even private messages from forums where users shared their theories about the missing tourists. Sarah would read them at night when insomnia was at her throat. But it was another ritual that disturbed her the most. Every year, on the day of her daughter's disappearance, a bouquet of white lilies would appear on their doorstep. No explanation, no signature, just an envelope with an inscription in clear black marker. She was beautiful. It happened for the first time exactly 1 year after the tragedy. At first, Sarah thought it was a sympathetic gesture from one of her neighbors, but the repetition of it year after year made it an eerie sign. She showed the envelopes to the police. They just shrugged their shoulders. Maybe an anonymous donor who is worried. But for Sarah, these bouquets were not just a symbol. It was a reminder that someone knows more than they say. Someone was watching their family. Rumors spread quickly in the city. Some believed that the flowers were left by a secret admirer who had once been in love with Eliza. Others whispered that it was her kidnapper playing tricks on her mother. The fact that the bouquet always appeared at night without any witnesses only added to the feeling of persecution. Tom tried to explain everything logically. He said, "Someone is just trying to honor her memory." But Sarah didn't believe him. Every time she got up at dawn, opened the door, looked at the flowers, and felt a chill down her spine. Each stem was like a silent message. "We remember her. We see you." Years passed. The official reports were moldering in police archives, but for Sarah and Tom, time stood still. In the living room, the clock ticked away the hours, as if counting the years of their wait. On Eliza's birthday, Sarah would always set out her favorite cake, light a candle, and wait a minute in silence. It always ended the same way. The cold silence of the house and another box with a receipt for flowers. No one ever saw who brought those bouquets. Not a single surveillance camera on the street recorded any suspicious movements. It was as if the person who did it knew how to remain invisible. This seemingly insignificant ritual gradually became proof to Sarah that the story of her daughter was not over. She believed that it was not condolences, but a hint. The unknown person leaving the flowers might be involved in the disappearance. 7 years passed in this way. Silence, archives, and white lilies were the only witnesses to the fact that Eliza Reed's case was still alive. She had not disappeared from memory. It was waiting for its time to remind us of itself again. The Reed family home in a small Ohio town was plunged into nighttime silence. It was mid-July, Eliza's birthday. 7 years had passed since her disappearance, and this day had always turned into a quiet ritual. Sarah would place a plate with a small cake on the kitchen table, light a candle, and leave it to burn. Tom usually remained silent, sitting next to her and looking at the photo of his daughter hanging on the wall. At midnight, the house was engulfed in darkness. The old telephone line, which had remained in the house since the 90s, had not been used for a long time. The telephone, once Eliza's favorite in her teenage years, lay in the corner of the kitchen, covered with a thin layer of dust. It stood there more as a memento than a means of communication. When the silence was broken by a sharp ringing, Sarah first thought it was a hallucination from overwork. The metallic sound of the old phone seemed unreal. She shuddered and froze. Tom looked up, but didn't have time to say anything. Sarah walked over and picked up the phone. First, a stream of loud noise hit her ear. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, an ominous crackling sound that didn't resemble normal telephone noise. Sarah was about to hang up the phone, but suddenly, amidst the chaos, she heard something that made her freeze. It was a weak, distorted voice, as if it was coming through thick walls or alien mechanisms. But she recognized this voice instantly. It was her daughter. "Mom, they won't let me go. Find my eyes." Sarah jerked the phone away as if it were a burn. Her heart was racing. Tom ran over and grabbed the phone, but there was only the same scratching sound and then silence. The line was disconnected. They both stood in the kitchen, stunned, with the feeling that reality had just cracked. 7 years of silence, and suddenly, this voice. Words that made no sense, but at the same time seemed like a cry for help. Sarah did not sleep the rest of the night. She replayed what she'd heard over and over again. Her hands trembled as she wrote every word down on paper so she wouldn't forget. Tom tried to explain it away as a hallucination or a joke, but he looked as if he no longer believed his own words. The next morning, they called the phone company. Employees checked the call logs. The call was indeed recorded, but the number it came from did not exist. There was no subscriber with those numbers in the database. The line was not registered to any operator. This fact made the incident even more eerie. How could the signal have broken into their network? The company's report stated, "The call passed through several external gateways that do not belong to any civilian operator." In other words, the call came out of nowhere. Sarah sat in the kitchen for a long time, holding the phone in her hands as if she was expecting it to ring again. But the phone never rang again. The silence that followed seemed even heavier. She knew it wasn't a dream or a joke. She recognized the voice. Eliza lived in those words, even if they sounded through the years and through unknown obstacles. For the family, the call was a new shock. For the police, it was a strange anomaly that was difficult to explain. But one thing was clear. The case, which had been considered closed, had a new, disturbing extension. When the Reed family brought their daughter's written words and phone company information to the local police station, the officer on duty shrugged his shoulders skeptically. To the police, it looked like a typical case of fraud, someone taking advantage of someone else's grief using technical tricks. Stories like this had happened before, and most often they turned out to be silly jokes or attempts to get money. However, in this case, everything was different. The call did not follow a classic route. The first checks showed that the signal passed through a series of gateways that were not officially used by any civilian company. The log showed satellite hops that resembled a military or experimental communication scheme. Cybercrime experts were called in immediately. A temporary team was set up at the police station to analyze the call's route. According to the engineers, such a signal, wandering, is impossible to adjust without sophisticated equipment. This could not have been done by a student or an amateur. This requires infrastructure, access to satellite channels, and knowledge that costs millions, the protocol states. At first, they considered the version of a technical failure, but the phrase that came out raised doubts. The voice Sarah recognized was not a random set of sounds. It wasn't a glitch or an automatic record from the database. It was a specific short phrase. Mom. They won't let me go. Find my eyes. In the meeting room, these words were reviewed over and over again. The police tried to give a rational explanation. Some believed that the attackers could have recorded fragments of Eliza's voice from her old social media videos and edited the message. Others suggested that it could have been a system error, the overlap of several signals. But cyber experts insisted that the way the call route was constructed was indicative of deliberate action. Someone deliberately imitated a call from a non-existent number. The route recording was sent to the Federal Service for the Protection of Communications. The conclusion confirmed the previous suspicions. The call was not a schoolchildren's joke or a trivial prank. It was an operation using satellite channels that were not officially in the public domain. The case was officially reopened the same day. The file labeled "Closed" was reopened, adding a new section, Satellite Anomaly. Investigators asked themselves several key questions. First, who could have access to such equipment? Second, why was the family of the missing tourist, whose case had not been moving for 7 years, chosen as the target? Third, what does the phrase, "find my eyes," mean? The answer to the last question was discussed separately. Psychologists also took part in the meeting. Some believed that the words were a random set of words that made no sense, but Sarah insisted that this message had a hidden meaning. Eyes could be a symbol, a key, a hint to something that belonged to Eliza. Tom, more pragmatic, emphasized that it could be a code phrase that his daughter would use to let him know she was alive. But even he couldn't explain why an old phone line that the family hadn't used in a long time was used for this purpose. The official report stated, "Given the complexity of the call route and the specifics of the phrase, there is a high probability of deliberate imitation. The purpose of the actions is unknown. Further investigation is necessary." The archive case has become relevant again. The police got old materials of the search operation, maps of the canyon, photos of the place where the backpack was found, and interrogation protocols of the rangers. All this stuff, which had been lying around for years, was now being laid out on tables in a special room in the police station. Sarah watched the work through the glass and felt strangely relieved. For the first time in a long time, she saw that her daughter had not been forgotten. But at the same time, her fear was growing. If someone had really imitated the call, then that person could be involved in the disappearance. It seemed that the case, buried in files and dust, had come to life. And every time a diagram of the route of a strange call from unknown satellites flashed on the wall, everyone in the room had the feeling that someone was watching them from the shadows. The Reed family's house turned into an archive. The basement was filled with boxes of papers, newspaper clippings, and internet printouts. In the closets were Eliza's things that Sarah never dared to give away or throw away. She kept even the small things that others would consider unnecessary. Old movie tickets, college notebooks, small souvenirs from her travels. Each thing was evidence that her daughter existed, lived, and laughed. After the strange phone call, Sarah could no longer see these things as mere memories. She began to look for the key among them. The phrase, "find my eyes," kept haunting her. One evening, when she was alone, she brought out the old digital camera that Eliza had used during her studies to the kitchen table. The black case was scratched, but the lens shone in the light of the lamp. Sarah held it in her hands and suddenly felt her daughter's words make sense. The eyes are not a metaphor. They are a camera, a lens through which Eliza saw the world and recorded it. The camera was never found after she disappeared. It was not in her backpack, which was found cut open under a rock. It disappeared along with her phone and satellite beacon. Sarah began to look through the jackets left in the closet. In the inside pocket of one of them, a blue windbreaker that Eliza had worn in the months before the trip, she felt a folded piece of paper. It was an old pawn shop receipt. The yellowed paper bore the date, a few days before the disappearance. The word lens was written in the description of the item column. Sarah's heart sank. Her daughter had pawned some of her equipment. What for? The receipt had the address of a pawn shop in a small town near Zion Park. Sarah immediately checked online and found that the place had been closed for a long time. The building was empty. The business had stopped several years ago. She brought the discovery to the police. Investigators who were already looking into the strange call recorded the receipt as new evidence. This meant that a few days before she disappeared, Eliza needed money so urgently that she pawned her expensive lens. The amount was not large. She was going to buy it back, but did not have time. This was a turning point for the police. For the first time in 7 years, there was a concrete trail leading from the mountains back to the city. In the report, they wrote, "It is necessary to identify the owner of the pawn shop and check the archival documents." Sarah looked at the receipt and felt a connection emerge between the words, "Find my eyes," and reality. If the camera was missing, then perhaps it was the key her daughter wanted to leave behind. The memory card could contain footage from her last day, perhaps the face of the person who was watching her. For the family, it opened a new page. For the police, it was a new line of investigation. It seemed that the archives, which had been gathering dust for years, came to life with this piece of paper with barely visible ink. And, for the first time since the strange call, it became clear that there was a person in the case who had received part of Eliza's eyes while she was still alive. And now, it was necessary to find out who it was. The town at the entrance to Zion National Park looked like a quiet tourist center. A few hotels, coffee shops, souvenir shops, and abandoned buildings that showed that the local business had failed. Among the empty facades, an old pawn shop stood out with its rusted sign with peeling paint and closed shutters. It was there that the detectives went to check the receipt Sarah found in her daughter's jacket. The former owner of the establishment was found in a small house on the outskirts of the city. He was well over 70. The man limped and moved slowly, but his memory remained sharp. He invited the investigators into the living room, which was filled with old furniture, and immediately realized why they had come. He remembered the girl. He told them that Eliza had come to him on a hot day, carrying a lens case. "She looked worried," he said. "She said she needed money for a ticket home urgently, but she would definitely come back for the item in a week." The lens, as the owner recalled, was expensive, professional, and much more valuable than the amount he could give for it. But the girl insisted, and he arranged a deposit. He recorded all the data in the logbook. At the request of the investigators, he took out an old accounting book. The pages were yellowed, but the entries were clear. The date column showed the day a few days before Eliza's disappearance. The status column read, "Not redeemed." However, another pencil mark appeared under the entry. A month after the girl disappeared, the lens was bought for cash. The owner emphasized that the person did not bargain. paid the amount, and immediately took the item. He remembered the buyer well. Tall, thin, dark glasses, even indoors. On his right hand, there was a noticeable scar, as if from a deep cut, the old man described. He added that the man spoke little, behaved coldly, and looked as if he did not want to be remembered. This description was the first concrete trace in all the years of investigation. Until now, only the family, rangers, and searchers were involved in the case. Now, for the first time, there was a person who could be connected to Eliza's belongings after her disappearance. The police recorded every detail. The logbook was seized as material evidence. The owner was photographed for the record, and his testimony was officially recorded. For Sarah, this information came as a shock. She imagined that someone else, someone she didn't know, was holding something that was part of her daughter, her eyes. And now, this someone had a specific description. Federal agents compiled a brief description of the suspect. Male, tall, wears dark glasses, prominent scar on his arm. Purchased Eliza Reed's lens from a pawn shop a month after her disappearance. This paragraph was the first new line in a case that had remained frozen for years. From that moment on, the direction of the investigation changed. The focus was no longer on the canyon, the elements, or an accident. For the first time after 7 years of silence, the shadow of a specific person appeared on the horizon. And this shadow came not from the desert, but from the city, from a life that had always seemed ordinary. The cyber investigation lab was silent, broken only by the whirring of servers and short commands from technicians. On the screens were dozens of images downloaded from Eliza's public accounts. Most of the photos were familiar to the family. A smiling girl against the backdrop of red rocks, views of the canyon, a few selfies near a cliff. But this time, the experts were not looking at them for memories. They used software capable of detecting the smallest anomalies in images, from reflections in mirror surfaces to shadows that do not belong to the photographer. In one of the pictures, a selfie taken on the trail, the technician noticed something strange. In the shadow of a large rock, at the very edge of the frame, a blurred silhouette was visible. At first, one might have thought it was a random play of light, but after zooming in, it became clear. It was a human figure. We compared other photos from the same day. In the picture overlooking the canyon, a dark figure was again visible in the background. In another shot taken near a stone outcropping, there was a shadow that followed the shape of a human shoulder. All of these pictures had a common feature. The object stood at a distance, never coming close, but always remaining in the camera's field of view. The conclusion was obvious. Someone was following Eliza that day. And they did it unnoticed, staying on the edge of visibility. The technicians uploaded the photos to a special module that restored the smallest details. The algorithm increased the contrast and restored the outlines. It turned out that the silhouette showed something like a long sleeve and a hat with a wide brim. The face remained in darkness. Metadata analysis brought even more interesting results. A hidden geotag was found on one of the photos, which was posted on a social network after the girl's disappearance. It did not correspond to any standard format that a camera or smartphone automatically sets. It was a manually added string with coordinates. Experts noted that this geotag appeared after the photo was published. Someone had accessed Eliza's account, edited the file, and left the tag there. It couldn't have been an accident. There was only one question: who and for what purpose? If the coordinates were true, they led to a remote part of the park, off the tourist routes. If it was disinformation, it could have led the police in the wrong direction. The technicians in the report called this match a digital fingerprint of an unknown person. They explained that this method, leaving hidden data in a media file, is used by those who want to either convey a hidden message or, conversely, confuse the investigation. The room was tense. On the screen, an enlarged photo showed a blurry shadow in the mountains, which now looked not like a coincidence, but like evidence of presence. The police had a new direction in their hands. The conclusion was recorded in the case file. The photos of Eliza show an unknown person who probably followed her on the day of her disappearance. An artificially added geotag to one of the photos was also found. The actions of an unauthorized person were confirmed by digital analysis. This was the first real appearance of a digital ghost, a person who was both in the photos and in the digital data structure itself. His figure emerged from the shadow of the mountains and at the same time from the shadow of the web. The news came as a blow to the Reed family. Sarah heard the words in her head again, "Find my eyes." And she realized that her daughter might have actually seen him through the lens. After analyzing the photos and discovering a hidden geotag, investigators for the first time got a real thread that led beyond the archival materials. Cyber specialists traced the activity associated with the coordinates and came up with a suspicious IP address. It was encrypted, belonged to a range used only by experienced users familiar with surveillance bypass technologies. It became immediately clear that this was not an amateur or a random prankster. At a meeting at the police department, they discussed a single plan to force this person to reveal himself. To do this, they decided to use a bait. A message appeared in closed groups for photographers and hunters of rare files. A memory card was recently discovered, probably belonging to Eliza Reed. It contains a series of her last photos before her disappearance. The message looked like an accidental leak planted by one of the former technicians. The ploy worked. In a few hours, out of dozens of views, the ones coming from the suspicious IP stood out. The observer could not resist and took the bait. The apartment of Sarah, who agreed to cooperate with the police, was equipped with cameras, motion detectors, and a silent alarm. Several officers were in ambush in the neighboring rooms. Sarah knew that this time the danger could be close, but she decided to take the risk. That night, around 11 o'clock, the detector on the back door went off. The alarm brought the police out of their standby state. A man in dark clothes and a mask entered the hallway. He moved confidently, as if he knew where he was going. He was holding a small device for jamming signals. The intruder headed into the room where Eliza's boxes were kept. He started rummaging through the old things as if he knew he was looking for them. At that moment, the officers gave the signal. The light of the flashlights cut through the darkness, and a shout of "Police!" was heard. The man rushed to the exit, but was stopped a few meters from the door. A short scuffle ended with him lying face down on the floor, handcuffed. When the mask was removed, it became clear that this was not the man with the scar described by the pawnshop owner. They were looking at a different man, younger, thinner, with sharp features. In his pockets, they found lockpicks, flash drives, and most importantly, a portable satellite transmitter. Experts quickly explained that such a device can imitate calls from any number using closed channels. This explained the call Sarah heard that night. It was not mystical. It was not an accident. Someone had programmed the equipment so that it would come to life years later. The detainee refused to answer questions. He was silent in the police station, lowering his head even during interrogation. In the report, he was described as a henchman, an executor who acted on someone else's orders. He did not have any documents or identification on him. His identity was established for a long time by checking his fingerprints in databases. For the police, this trap had a double result. They received evidence of technological intervention and arrested the person who had directly entered the house. But the main figure remained in the shadows. The man with the scar who had once bought Eliza's lens at a pawn shop never showed up. The report stated, "The detainee is allegedly related to the suspect. The detected transmitter confirms the technical possibility of imitating calls. The main customer has not been identified." Sarah looked at the report and felt the fear return with renewed vigor. Her daughter had disappeared in the mountains, but now it was clear. Someone was trying to hide the truth, even using sophisticated technology. And this person is still around. The transmitter seized from the detainee was immediately sent to a special data storage facility. It was not a cheap device, a satellite communication module combined with a memory unit. Its case was scratched and had traces of repair, indicating that it had been used for a long time. The laboratory specialists worked on it for several days. First, they analyzed the call routes it created. Then, they looked at the internal memory. Everything looked empty. Most sectors had been cleared. But at a deeper level, they found one file that had miraculously survived. When they opened it, the room fell silent. It was a short audio, only a few seconds. A clear woman's scream, desperate, fragmented. Then a voice that was unmistakably recognizable. Eliza. Her words sounded just like they had that night on the phone. "They wouldn't let me go." And then there was an abrupt cut. The audio file had a time stamp. The date coincided with the period of the first search, 7 years ago. This meant that the recording was made when everyone still hoped to find her alive. It had been in the device's memory all these years, hidden from prying eyes. The second surprise was the coordinates embedded in the file. They did not lead to the canyon or the trail where the trail had disappeared. The geotag pointed to a remote area of the desert, far from tourist routes. There was an old geodetic tower there, left over from the days when topographic surveys were conducted in the area. It had not been used officially for decades. Investigators checked the data with archival maps. The tower did exist. It was possible to get there only by off-road vehicle or on foot for several hours through the wasteland. This place was not visited by tourists, and the rangers hardly ever looked there. Inside the station, there was a lingering silence. Everyone realized that this was the key to the case. The phrase, "they wouldn't let me go," no longer seemed abstract. It was a confirmation that Eliza did not die immediately. She lived for some time, and someone was holding her. Federal agents made a plan to leave. They decided to check the tower secretly, without making any noise. A tactical team was prepared for this purpose. The order was simple: to record any traces of presence and determine whether it was possible to talk about a hiding place. For the family, this news was another blow. Sarah held the printout with the coordinates and could not hold back her tears. She was screaming. "She was there," she repeated. Tom sat next to her, clenching his fists, and remained silent. The internal report read, "An audio recording of Eliza Reed's voice, dated to the time of her disappearance, has been found. The embedded coordinates lead to a geodetic tower. There's a high probability that the victim was held for an unspecified period of time." This discovery moved the case forward. If earlier everything was reduced to a fall or an accident, now the police had proof. It was a kidnapping. And behind it was a man who knew how to work with technology, hide files, simulate calls, and disguise his presence. The last frame recorded in the device's memory was no longer a photograph. It was a scream, and it was leading them deep into the desert, to a tower that could be the key to the truth. The night desert seemed like an endless sea of darkness. Only the headlights of the SUVs carved narrow corridors of light out of it. The tactical group moved without unnecessary talk. Everyone realized that the moment was approaching that could put an end to the case that had remained unsolved for 7 years. On the map, The marker was glowing with a red dot. The old geodesic tower stood a few kilometers from the last road, forgotten by people, but not by those who turned it into a hideout. When the transport stopped, the soldiers scattered to their positions. The tower emerged from the darkness like a silhouette of another era. Its metal structures were rusted from time to time, but light barely leaked out from the inside. The silence of the desert made every sound loud. The creaking of sand underfoot, the click of fuses, the rustling of camouflage fabrics. The team entered from several sides at once. The door was knocked down with a battering ram. Inside, there was neither dust nor oblivion. A small laboratory, crammed with equipment, opened up before them. Rows of monitors shone with green and blue lines of data. Antennas went through the roof into the night sky. There was equipment for intercepting signals, several servers, and neatly folded cables. The atmosphere resembled an underground communication center. In the center of the room stood he, a tall man in dark clothes with scars on both arms that stood out even in the semi-darkness. He was not taken by surprise. He was sitting in a chair, as if waiting. When the soldiers pointed their weapons at him, he just raised his hands and smiled. During the search, it turned out that he was a former intelligence officer who had disappeared from the official lists several years ago. The documents read, "Dismissed due to mental disorders." In his own words, "I took care of beauty." He called himself a guardian of the territory. For him, tourists with cameras were a threat. He kidnapped those who photographed his places and made them muses. He forced them to live in isolation, watched them, and recorded their voices and screams. When the special forces searched the premises, they found a hiding place. There were dozens of women's things, shoes, jewelry, backpacks. On the tables were hundreds of photos, neatly arranged by date. A metal box contained several old phones and cameras. Among them is the one that belonged to Eliza. The memory card was damaged, but the last photo was recovered. It showed her face, full of fear. Her eyes reflected the face of a man with scars. It was not a denial, but a confirmation. She saw him and captured him at the last moment. During the interrogation, he spoke calmly, as if explaining routine things. He claimed that Eliza had lived in his hideout for almost a year. Then, she died of dehydration. He buried her in the desert, but refused to give the coordinates. "The desert took her, and will keep her," he said. The discovery of the transmitter also explained the call. The device had a function, an automatic distress signal that was supposed to go off in case of breakdown or loss of control. A system error activated it 7 years later, and it called the only number saved as home. For Sarah, this truth came as a cold verdict. It was not a voice from beyond, not a miracle, not a hope. It was a technological accident that exposed the perpetrator. The mystique dissipated, leaving only the horrific reality. Her daughter had been kidnapped, held, and then died in isolation. The search for the grave yielded nothing. The desert had swallowed up all traces. The report reads, "The victim's body was not found. The probability of burial in a remote area is high. No coordinates are available." The final line of the case sounded emotionless, but the family felt the weight of every word. They finally knew what had happened. And this knowledge brought not relief, but cold, cruel peace. The desert plunged back into silence. It did not give up Eliza's body, and perhaps it will never give it back.